All right, this podcast, it's been a while since an episode has been aired. In fact, it's been a long time since an episode has been produced. Paul and I have taken a little bit of not a purposeful break, but it just seems to be working out that way. So I thought I got to get my other crew on here. So Justin and Sileem are coming to us from Tokyo on a fine Sunday evening their time. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be back again.
It was beautiful out today. The weather shifting here in Tokyo. We're hopefully moving away from the chilly rain, and I think we're in, I guess, that 1 week of spring that we get before we turn to sweltering heat.
We had cold weather until about 2 weeks ago, and then suddenly it went from 8-9 degrees to like 20, 25. Yesterday it was 27 degrees, which is a bit warmer typically than May. But the weather in Canada, or at least this part where I'm in, typically it could go back down to like 12 next week. So don't want to jinx it. But gentlemen, thanks for coming on. And let's just do a quick, tiny update on COVID in Tokyo / Japan right now. What's happening there these days?
Justin, do you want
happening?
to cover this?
Yeah. I mean, what's happening, I don't know that much has shifted. There hasn't been a lot of official communication. It's been kind of like hands off, fairly. People are kind of left to their own devices. But every once in a while, there is a government announcement. And the most recent one was reaffirming how in public, outside, when walking or when moving about the city or moving about Japan in general, it's safe to not be wearing a mask. That with distancing in public, that's okay. And that's as close as you get to kind of a big change or shift in agenda. There's still plenty of cases. There's still people who are getting COVID. That's the reality. I see it in my kids' school, the weekly update and the numbers of people who are still getting it here and there. Every once in a while, there's a sleepover, and then you have 8 kids who get it, all at once, because there is a bit of this kind of relaxing of guard in a way that's slowly.
Yeah, like getting it isn't seen as this like thing you almost have to keep silent, and not silent, but you're afraid to talk about it. Like recently here, people get it, and it's like I've been amazed how many times you mention it. Like I had it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and it's amazing. Almost everyone I talked to said, "Oh yeah, we had it back in December," or my mother had it in February. It's like nobody was talking about that back then, but now everyone's talking about it. Sounds like it's similar there.
It is. Yeah. And, to one of the points, I guess you can kind of maybe touch on how it's affecting things there in Canada. There's also kind of a desire to return to some of the normalcy, and that goes to commerce as well. The yen has taken a hit recently against a lot of currencies, and I think there's enough pressure on leadership to kind of open things up a bit, try and get some tourism dollars in here. So they're running their first test case. There's been a lot of talk about how they're going to relax the rules, and how even people who are long-term residents here can bring over people. Depending if you're a permanent resident, you can bring up to 2 degrees of relationship. If you're a long-term resident, you can bring up to 1 degree of relationship. So in my case, it would be either a father or mother or a child of mine that's living overseas. I could actually, quote unquote, sponsor them now on a temporary tourist visa. So right now, that's already been relaxed. There are some hoops you have to jump through to get that, but at least Japan's opened up some of those things, and Japan's been one of the more strict countries. But then the other direction of this is talking about moving in the direction of actual general tourism, and they're actually running a test case. I think Sileem is at 50 people. I think they're going to do like this tiny test group of 50 people that are going to be monitored, and they're going to use the results of that as a way to decide if opening up things a little bit more to tourists is possible.
Wow, that's like a very measured approach. And yeah, the fact they're still talking about different layers like this, like that's pretty unreal, actually.
It is. And Japan's been very strict in terms of letting people into the country, but it's always been a bit weird because
In COVID though, or before? Because it seemed to me it was not that difficult to get in here. You have the visa on arrival. But when you say that, do you mean in COVID?
Yeah, before COVID, it was really easy. I mean, if you were from a Western country, typically visa on arrival. I mean, post COVID, forget the initial part where everywhere was locked down. But even when the world started easing up in terms of people traveling internationally. Japan, because Japan always let its own citizens come whenever they wanted to come back, and there were various degrees of quarantining or not quarantining, depending on when this was. But from my perspective, especially over the past maybe let's say half year, where most of the country's already been double vaccinated. A lot of people have been boosted, and still taking this super cautious approach towards letting people in. I'm like, well, if you're letting in Japanese people who are going abroad for tourism purposes and coming back, for instance, how does that really make too much of a difference from someone, a foreigner coming into Japan for tourism purposes? I get it. What happens if they get sick whilst here? Are they insured? All those questions come to mind. But there are probably ways to deal with that, whether it's through travel insurance that insures against the person if they get COVID, for instance, in country. They can make that mandatory or whatever whatever it is. There are probably ways of getting around it.
If they come in with like certain countries, you have to have to be at least double vaccinated.
Yeah, exactly. Be double vaxxed.
And if they did get sick, they may not have anything serious in terms of symptoms.
Exactly.
So
yeah. Exactly.
I could see a year ago or a year and a half ago what would a COVID patient from abroad mean to the Japanese healthcare system. Seems like something about a year and a half ago in terms of what the mystery of that, because there were still so many questions. But if you come into a country double vaccinated, for instance, when I had 2 weeks ago, it was fairly mild. It was about 3 to 4 days. Certainly didn't need to go to the hospital. I know that's not the same for everyone, but with certain restrictions and parameters in place, I think you could cover that off.
Exactly, yeah. So a bit too strict in my opinion, but at least we're kind of opening up.
I want to come back. I want to come visit.
You're always welcome once those borders open up.
And I'm bringing all the equipment with me.
Yeah. How cool would that be for you to actually record a session again from Tokyo?
It'd be amazing.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
We'd have to think about that. Would we set it up like, would we just go to like one of your places, or would we set up in the middle of Shibuya Station or something? I don't know. I think it would have to be, we'd have to take in the background ambiance somehow.
That would be cool.
Tokyo.
I mean, in its own way, right? We'll definitely think about that.
Let's do that. Well, speaking of that, in terms of setting up things, I recently did another PA announcing job with the Pickering Panthers last week, and I've shared it a couple times, talked about it a couple times with Paul, and I know I've told you guys about it outside of the podcast. But I did want to let people know that after a couple months of not really hearing from them, I got a call last week. It was on Friday, and my son and I were planning on actually going to the game because they were in the finals, the very finals of the Buckland Cup, it's called. It's the Stanley Cup version of the OJHL. And my son and I were going to go because I really wanted to see some games. And then I got COVID before that, so it really knocked out a lot of activities. And I got a call at 3:00, I think, on Friday last week, saying you always know when I see the name on my phone what it's going to be about. And I was lucky enough to go back last week and do Game 6, which was an elimination game. Pickering, had they won, which unfortunately they didn't win that game, would have would have, so I was at that game. They would have clinched, but it was really cool just getting pulled into a game of high consequence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any highlights from that game that stuck out?
Yeah.
For you?
Well, I was telling my dad yesterday that usually each game includes some mispronunciation of a player's name or screwing it up. Like, so the prep materials, which sometimes there's a lot and sometimes there isn't. There is a resource within the system that we work within where we can get player pronunciations for each of the teams. And lo and behold, when I went to this team that I was in, it was the Toronto Junior Canadiens. They didn't, I'd never seen the roster before. The games I'd done before were even repeats of other cities that were playing. But this team, brand new, never knew any of them. And for some reason, they were the only team in the 30 teams that didn't have player pronunciation guideline. So I had to go into that blind. So I was, so one of the it was a high sticking penalty. It was for one of the players, and his name was Loveto, Loveto. So I said, Toronto penalty to number 71, Jared Loveto. And he's in the penalty box right beside me. He's like, "There's no A in my name." and as you know, you're reading it, right? And you want it to be succinct and it's being broadcast over the speaker system.
Yeah.
So I had to use the brain to process, what is he talking about? I look at the name and I said, where is he saying the A? And I'm not, this is all happening within like 2 seconds, right? But it feels long. So I had to calmly figure out, what's he talking about? Oh, I said Loveto and said Loveto. So you always say that twice. So so you summarize it. So I said penalty. So I went through it and then I just said to number 77, 2 minutes for Loveto. Thank you. Time 6:14. So it was kind of funny. So that would have been maybe one of the highlights was just getting corrected from the penalty box by one of the opposing players. And I turned to him after, said, "Sorry about that." And he's like, "No worries, man." And sometimes they come in, and they had gone in for high sticking, and the other guy got an unsportsmanlike. So there was a bit of a jarring between the two of them, screaming across. So we sit right in the middle between the two penalty boxes. Oh, wow. So sometimes you will get like, you know, a lot of colorful language being shouted through us to the other side and banging of sticks and stuff. And when they come in to give the referee will give us what the details are. And quite often they'll be slamming their sticks and we're like, we can't hear it. And then the ref will skate away and we're like, sometimes we have to buzz them to come back. So that's one of the interesting parts of that job is just where you're positioned on the ice, and you can be right literally in the middle of some heated moments.
Wow. Got to make sure that mic isn't hot when they're cursing at each other, right?
There's they probably wouldn't pick them up. That's one thing about the system there. It's not the greatest. You really have to pound your voice into the center of the mic to get it to, I've read, so it wouldn't, hot mic isn't too bad of an issue there, but there have been times where my colleague, who's the music scorekeeper, basically every timekeeper, he does everything. I've got one job, that's to speak when there's something happens. His job is everything else. So there's been a couple times where I've said to him, when I'll criticize something or mention, and I'll just look at that on switch to make sure it's switched off.
Right.
I doubt it would pick it up, but there are a few times where I've had to double check that it's, not live or hot.
Wow.
That's fantastic. So when you say you have a resource that provides kind of in advance the pronunciations, I'm sure they break it down by syllable and there's different ways for you to know where to emphasize and things like that. Is that coming from like a PR communications department of the team, the visiting team, or?
It's coming from the league. It's like a media guide or it's coming from the league. Okay. So all the teams are listed in there. So it's like in fact, anyone can Google like OJHL player pronunciations and probably find it. yeah, it just so happened for that one team there were none, and there were only a couple tricky names. And actually, I'll finish with this. There was one player that plays for Pickering who's got what I've always viewed as the most complicated name to say. And the games that I did up to this point, he never factored into any of them, but I was always concerned, what am I going to do when he does? And so his name
is that one of those Greek names?
That's right.
Right.
So
right, yeah.
I forget his first name because it's fairly basic, but his last name is Papaspiropoulos. And he scored a goal and an assist in the last game. So I had fun with that one. It's just I just went all out, and it went okay. I think I pronounced it right, but that was the one I was always so afraid I was going to trip over. If I ever had to do it.
Do you go like especially with those longer names? Do you go kind of like, I don't know, how do you say, like sing-songy with the names, like Papa Spiropoulos? Like, do you do any of that? Oh, okay.
I do, and you know, it's funny because I always, when I thought of doing this job, my belief was it was going to be done in a fairly straight way, like not to be, you know, the big crazy Vegas, like the Vegas Knights, for example, have a very animated PA announcer, and I'm just like, no, that is not me. I like being more, official about it. I'm not here to rally the crowd. I never saw myself as a crowd rallier kind of cheerleader person. However, it kind of came in naturally that when I did, like, for one of the jobs of this role is to announce the players, the starting lineups.
Right.
And so they all, each team stands on the blue line before the game starts, before the anthem, and gets introduced. So for the opposing team, it's always a very, basic thing. But as I did the first and second game, third game, I started to put a little bit more color into it, but not in a crazy way, not in a way that was still authentic.
Right. 1990 Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan. 6'6" from North Carolina.
Yeah. Like I really do believe that the job of this is not to make this about me, which we've all seen sporting events where when it becomes about the refs or the umpires or about some side person that has nothing to do with anything in the game.
Right.
But in a sense that the game does need a little bit of a cheerleader, kind of pep up the crowd. That is kind of what a PA announcer does. So I did it in a way I would say was pretty authentic to me, and worked. It worked. And I remember when I did that first game, I said, don't try to do anything except just the official business you're to do. Get that part accomplished. Like, that's why I was so happy I got 4 games in the beginning, because it was like being called. I think I said this in one of the episodes. It's like getting called up as a player. If you're told, okay, you're going to be around for a couple of weeks, regardless of how you perform. So don't worry too much about one game being your only shot. So that's how I looked at this when I was told initially I had 4 games I was going to do. I mean, they could have cut ties with me after the first game if they thought I was horrible. But that really provided me with the option to say, okay, warm up, get into it, get it right. It's not a one-shot deal sort of thing.
Yeah.
So now that you've gotten a taste of this, what do you feel about, what are your feelings about it going forward? I mean, if they call you back and they say, hey, would you be interested for next season in a different capacity, or, what have you thought through what your response may be?
Yeah. So the only capacity I would be interested in would be that capacity, like in the sense of, would you like to come back and do it? I guess the difference would be you'd be the guy. So you would now be the main person. And if you can't come one night, then we find your replacement. The only thing is my wife said to me, because she's been pretty cool about all this. She's been excited whenever when I came to her last Friday and said, they need me tonight. She's like, no way. I said, yeah, it's game 6. And she's like, she got excited about it. And then I did get a note after the next day saying, thanks so much for filling in. She said, the woman I report to, she says, I'm pretty sure you're going to get offered the job full time next year if you're interested. So I told my wife that. I said, yeah, I think they're going to give it to me. And she's like, do you want it? Like, just think about it for a sec. How many games are we talking about? 1 to 2 times a week. Like, you've got a job, you've got a family. So think about what you're committing to. And so I've talked to a friend of mine who is almost as excited about this as me, who wants to be, he says he'll be my backup, and I think he would do a fine job of it. So my thinking is I would just tell them I'll do it for like 75% of the time. I'll commit to it, and then I'll have a backup. Yeah. And I'll try to let you know as much in advance as possible. Like, I'm not going to be, the reason I got called in was last minute cancellations by the main guy. Like, I couldn't believe it that there were 3 times one time he got COVID. It was last minute and it could be understandable, but I don't know what happened on game 6. Like, short of being in a car accident or a death in the family, what makes you call 3 hours before a game to say I can't be there? So strange on a game like that. So yeah.
I think it's awesome that you've chased this. I mean, this is in some ways what a boyhood dream and something that you've pursued in adulthood. It's a great example for pursuing your passions, and it's great for your children to see, that this is something that's continuous. It's not just, doesn't just stop in early adulthood when we're kind of first striking out on our own. It can keep going on throughout our adult life.
And I really do see the value in it too, because all of what you just said, but it actually is very good practice for being able to, like, in a speech, we've all had the ums and ahs or whatever, and the maybe you need to just take a deep breath, gather yourself mid-speech, and just pause and sort of collect yourself if maybe you've forgotten something. And it's okay, the audience is forgiving. But in something like this, because it's being broadcast, and it's not just like a speech, it's not a speech, it's official stuff that has to come out and be succinct and be heard. It's a different muscle that's being exercised with this type of speaking. So it's actually I think, really good for me.
Mm-hmm. Stakes are higher too. You're at risk of getting pummeled by a 110 kilogram defenseman.
Yeah. It's in the description of the job, it will say ability to pivot at the last minute. Like, you have to be able to switch. You could be handed information out of the blue that you need to broadcast. And so there's definitely needs to be able to pivot when necessary, in the job description. And, I've been doing pretty well with that so far. But I think the best thing about it is the reps this is giving me. Like the sports industry in general, there are levels. So this is, several levels below the NHL, but there are levels on the way up from here that, I was thinking, could I put in my contract if I get called to do a higher level game, that I have permission from the organization to go do that, which typically happens in real sports, right? If coaches can talk to other teams if it's about a higher level position or whatever. And, this is not at all that serious, but the thing is this is the minor leagues, what I'm doing. But there are levels above that, honestly, I really would love to be able to get a crack at going up to the next level. So yeah, it's been fun. This episode is brought to you by Pace Painting. Pace Painting, serving all your painting needs, whether commercial or residential. Reach Pace Painting at paintwithpace@gmail.com or via their Facebook page, Pace Painting Inc. Or call Peter at 289-356-7744. Paint with Pace.
The other day I was thinking about animation and cartoons and about perceptions of those things in different places in the world. In Japan, animation or anime are very popular versions of content, of entertainment. You have it in book and manga form, and you have it in TV series and full-length feature films. And you have a lot of series that have been around for decades. some very prominent films that kind of were markers within the animation field. But if you look at that against maybe some countries like the US or maybe even Canada, I'm not sure as much. Clark, you can speak to that. There's this perception of animation for adults that for a long time, it was kind of like, well, wait a minute, cartoons are for kids. And maybe that's in part because we grew up with cartoons. We grew up with, Tom and Jerry and Warner Brothers and Looney Tunes and everything in between. And then there just reaches a certain point where it's just purely focused on Hollywood features. And as an adult, you don't really consume those things. And to me, what's starting to shift, at least in the West, is, before you might have had Pixar films, like especially like the early Pixar films, like Toy Story and all those things, where they were geared towards children and they had these clever little wink, wink jokes that were for adults. And this happened in movies like Shrek and Toy Story and all these other ones. You had these jokes that were definitely for adults, but they were more wink, wink. And then as we've moved forward, and as Pixar has kind of grown to be this model to try and be everything to everyone, they're carrying some very adult themes, everything from divorces to job loss to all kinds of just different heavy, situations that are at the center of a lot of the stories for these families and different characters that are in the films. And there's definitely an attempt by a lot of Hollywood, and I mean, this goes to Marvel and everything else for that matter, to try and utilize content that plays to the nostalgia that we have from our youth, but is doing so in a more an adult way. But there's still this kind of general perception, I find, in the West around animation and around cartoons that a lot of it's for quote unquote kids. And obviously there's some exceptions like The Simpsons and Family Guy, and maybe even more recent ones like Archer that are definitely, purely geared for adults. But, I think we've lost sight in a way too, because long ago, there was a lot of animated stuff that was being made for adults. And there was MTV had a whole series of stuff called Adult Swim, which one of them was based off of the Japanese anime Aeon Flux. And then there were other ones like Bill Plimpton, who was a very famous cartoonist who made a lot of great content that was wildly adult, but very, very creative stuff. And then you had Beavis and Butthead and things like that aired throughout the 90s. But a lot of that stuff kind of died down. And then, you kind of go full cycle all the way back to now. And I still kind of find like the West has this perception of animated films. And I guess what I wanted to explore with you guys is why is it, or is it still that way in Canada and the US, your perception? And also in Japan, why is the relationship with animation so different or maybe more ingrained that there isn't as much this hang up or stigma around animation from a standpoint of being consumed by adults just as much as children?
When you say that stigma, do you mean that the stigma of adults shouldn't like this? Or is that what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, stigma? I mean, there's very prominent people within like the film criticism areas, entertainment industry, and even just people in general that I knew living in the US that just had this at arm's length about a lot of animated films. And, Clark, we've talked about, Miyazaki films, specifically the famous Japanese cartoonist, illustrator who started Ghibli Studios years ago and has produced many, many famous films from everything from Howl's Moving Castle to Spirited Away to Princess Mononoke to My Neighbor Totoro, Porco Rosso, lots of really, really great animated films that, again,
and Spirited Spirit of the West. It's a band. Spirited Away is, I believe, the most successful Japanese movie of all time, whether it's animated or not. I think, in terms of sales or revenue generated,
is or was. I think there's been like a couple of films in recent years that I think came up against it. Or I came pretty close.
We'll have to get our producer to look that up.
So yeah, to your question, I guess my question is, you, Clark, you're worldly, you've lived in different countries, you've been exposed to some of this stuff. You're not necessarily the rule. I would say you're more the exception for a lot of folks that I've encountered in North America when it comes to adults and their perceptions of animated films. And I'm just wondering what your exposure is to maybe folks like that. I could add a little bit of color onto it later too with people I've encountered. And then, from your perspective, Sileem, I believe from just some pre-notes, pre-comments that you've made, that there is a strong affinity that you have to a lot of animated content.
Yeah. So my exposure to animation is really from my friend Mike, who's been on this podcast a couple times. He's the special effects guy. Mike was influential in me learning about who Miyazaki was. I didn't know who he was. And Spirited Away I had heard from through Tim Ferriss, his podcast. It's one of his favorite movies of all time. So I knew about it, but then Mike is one who connected it to the whole Miyazaki thing, that there's other movies other than Spirited Away. And as a kid, I grew up watching the stuff you described, the Warner Brothers, the Looney Tunes. And then I remember Batman had an animated cartoon that I remember my dad would come by while I was watching it and be like, why are you watching that? Like, what are you watching cartoons for? This is when I was probably 16 maybe. And I really enjoyed this Batman cartoon. It had a darkness to it, like Batman typically does, versus that zany, goofy stuff that a lot of cartoons, it was certainly not a SpongeBob Batman cartoon. But what I've found is that my thirst for that had gone away. I didn't really care too much about animation until I rediscovered it through Miyazaki. And fortunately, I actually got to see the studio Ghibli or Ghibli. I'm always not sure how to say it, but I did get to see the studios in Tokyo, which were incredible. If you get a chance, or haven't, for anyone listening to this, if you get to Japan and have any interest in animation or Miyazaki, go to that museum. It's fantastic. But I would say generally it's more from here. Like the average person isn't watching cartoons, isn't reading comics. It's definitely a niche thing, at least as far from where I sit. But I tried to introduce my kids to Miyazaki, and they liked it. I don't know they'd voluntarily look it up and watch it on their own, but I tried to plant that seed because I thought the Miyazaki stuff in particular has such a it's so good. It's so good. And anyway, I'll stop there because I want Sileem to have a chance to chime in.
Well, I mean, you raised an interesting point there, where even though you may try to introduce your children to Miyazaki's films, the Studio Ghibli films, it's not necessarily easy for children to jump straight in. And they'd probably be watching the English dub version. Not that it makes, I'm always a fan of the original language, although animation actually does make it a little bit easier, even if it's dubbed, to follow through. There's not the same level of,
lip sync, the syncing of the words,
the syncing of the word, not matching, that kind of stuff. I'm always a fan of. I can't stand dubbed. I always watch it in subtitles, but with animation, it's a little bit easier to accept.
And we did, as with the kids there, I figured if I'm going to get them on board, I think I have a better chance of doing it with the dubbed English voices versus, that I figure that's another layer we can go to another time if you get into it. But
yeah, exactly right. But for me, Miyazaki is, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say it's even for children, right? It's, there are messages to be taken from Miyazaki's films, whatever they are, and there are plenty, and they're almost all very good, in my opinion. I'm a big fan, and I think if anything, they're geared more towards adult audiences, right? Spirited Away, for instance. It's a beautiful movie. I love it, and it's certainly one of my favorite. And it came out. That was released in 2001 when I was 9 years old then, and I saw it back then. And even as a child, you kind of don't really understand it on the first go. You watch it as a child, you enjoy some of the the story, and you can follow through. But then when you watch it multiple times, when you watch it as an adult, you understand some of the more sort of difficult themes within that movie, for instance. And I won't go through them, because if anyone hasn't watched them, I do want them to just watch it and see what they think. Something like My Neighbor Totoro was something I watched growing up, and in that movie, even though there are it's very much fantasy, right? It's fantasy animation, but there are themes in there that are very deep, right? They talk about things like moving away and disease and sort of sickness, disease, death. Lots of difficult topics are explored in that, and one that's maybe I don't know whether this is more, maybe it's not necessarily more famous or popular, but one of Studio Ghibli's even earlier creations, and I think Miyazaki was not the director for this one, but Grave of the Fireflies.
Yes,
is just saying the title, it makes me shiver a bit. It's one of those, in my opinion, one of the most profound movies I've ever seen in my life. And probably it is by far the saddest movie I've ever seen in my life. And it is an animation, one I would encourage anyone to watch, especially considering what's going on with the war in Ukraine, for instance, and conflicts around the world, because it explores the very, very human side of war and conflict, and how that impacts the individual, right? So again, all I've spoken about right now, I mean, and I've spoken more about sort of Ghibli and Studio Ghibli, but it shouldn't necessarily just be about that, right? I think whether it's Studio Ghibli, or whether it's something that I watched growing up, like the Flintstones, for instance. It's an American cartoon animation that, even though you can, I suppose, again, perhaps geared for children, but I remember vividly when I was watching it as a child, my father would sort of come into the room where I was watching TV, and he'd watch the Flintstones for a bit, and they say, they're exploring some sort of really interesting topics here. This is a good. It's a good cartoon. I encourage you to continue watching this.
Oh, interesting. Would he laugh at things that you were like, what was funny about that? Or like that kind of thing too? Or
yeah, and there was a bit of that as well. There will always be things that, as a kid, you probably wouldn't understand. And when you rewatch it as an adult, you pick up on, it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. But yeah, I don't think there should be any stigma around whatever you want to call it, cartoon, animation.
Except if it's SpongeBob. I'll admit I have never given it much of maybe a chance, but SpongeBob seems like that kind of cartoon, and you guys can maybe have more to say, but if I was to see an adult watching that a lot, I would question them.
Oh, there's
perhaps.
No question.
Is that
no? There's no question. The answer is they smoke a lot of weed.
Yeah. Okay. I would have to think.
I'll be transparent here. The people I knew that watched a lot of it, they smoked a lot of weed. So
the people I know who have watched it typically are under 10. So I and this is where, maybe going back to your original point, Justin, is that my dad, when he walked by and saw and he has a lot of colorful things to say about SpongeBob, because he used to watch my nephew watching it and was like, what is going on there? Like, this is just not right. I've never seen anything more like brainless than that.
Do you, either of you remember a cartoon called Ren and Stimpy?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this was kind of like all in that same period in the mid to late 90s. Nickelodeon had these shows like Ren and Stimpy, Rugrats, and a few others like it. And not only the illustration, but the storylines were a bit in the kind of like psychedelic, psychotropic type of direction. And I think a lot of it is just stemming from the fact that their writers were mostly, children of the 60s themselves. And if you look at some of the stuff that was kind of coming out around then, it was just like, if they weren't dropping acid then, they were doing it at some point to be coming up with these landscapes. So, I feel like SpongeBob in some ways is almost an homage to some of that stuff. I'm sure those illustrators grew up on those previous illustrators. That's my feel. That's my tone sense of that stuff. But yeah, to your point, I mean, what is it about? I don't know. It's nonsensical.
Yeah.
But there's fun. There's fun in that, isn't there? I mean, I can watch SpongeBob now, and I know I'm not learning anything. I might not necessarily be learning anything from it, but and who knows? Maybe there is something to be learned as well. But it as entertainment, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a second chance for SpongeBob. Justin, you were going to say something there.
Well, I mean, Sileem kind of made a comment there that made me kind of think about what I was going to mention too, which is, it doesn't have to be about something. It could be escapism, right? And animation, just like any other form of entertainment, has escapism as a platform. But what I was curious to ask Sileem from his perception, having been a large part of his life here in Japan, what is it about animation, that is it's one of the main channels of entertainment in a way, right? It's just another part of the language of articulating the human experience. You were saying about, Grave of the Fireflies, no different than, in my mind, than Porco Rosso or The Wind Rises. Those are also movies that were very much about war and about things going on around the war and the people caught up in it in different ways, humanizing them, but also the human experience that everyone experiences, regardless of the timing. And I'm just curious, like, what is it about animation that's just one of the main languages here in Japan of articulating the human experience or entertainment in general? Like, why is it that in Japan it's very prevalent? Is it the permeation of it from childhood? Is it that there's so much content that kind of helps you graduate from, elementary, junior high, college, university? Like, is there just so much content at each stage that everyone's so used to it? Like, what's your perception of why it's...
I think, I mean, there's definitely the historical context as to begin with, right? I mean, and I don't know whether this is directly related or not, but something like Ukiyo-e, which was sort of an early form of telling stories with pictures, with images in Japan. I don't know whether that was during the Edo period or not, but it would be. I'm guessing from 400 maybe odd years ago, and don't quote me on this, but there's always been a sort of historically in Japan a culture of telling stories through images, and I think that moved into manga, moved into anime eventually, and there's just so much content out there, so much good content out there, and there's content for everyone, right? So when there's something for everyone, it's very hard to dismiss anime as a medium for just children, for instance, or for just one segment of the community. There's literally something for everyone, and when there's something for everyone, it's very hard for you to wholesale say, well, this is not it's not for me. I don't think there's anyone in Japan who doesn't appreciate one type or another of anime. whether it was just in a certain part of their life, or as they grew up through different stages of their lives as well. So,
I just want to
and the
clarify
quality
for our listeners: when you say ukiyo-e, you're talking about like woodblock prints, right? Like
woodblock prints, yeah.
Right. Okay. So for our listeners, ukiyo-e is like original imagery as a storytelling device, right? In Japanese culture, right? So a famous one would be, for our listeners, they might recognize the famous Hokusai Great Wave, the tsunami wave would be one of the more famous images that I would say our listeners, international listeners, might recognize as a Japanese woodblock print. These were prints that were carved by artisans to then reprint an original image created by someone like Hokusai or other famous artists like Hiroshige, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So
there's
I'll
put that in the show notes as well. I'm looking at the Hokusai. Like Hokusai, I see the tidal wave, 36 views of Mount Fuji, Fuji Cotton. These are some of these. So Hokusai is the artist?
Yes,
artist.
Not the style of the art, or has that almost become one and the same?
No, artist. There were definitely
the artist.
Yeah. I mean, he definitely had emulators, people who tried to copy his style. Every genre of art and every era of art has had people, who also wanted to make money. So they said, "Oh, this guy's doing well. I'm going to try and copy that style, crib that style." So,
yeah.
So we got to move on, but before we do, one thing about, maybe it's more fairy tales than cartoons, but I think cartoons also sort of go into this direction, is morality tales, where it's trying to teach something, Hansel and Gretel, don't talk to strangers, otherwise you might end up in a little, as tempting as it may be, you could end up in a lot of trouble, listen to your parents, but also the conflict of the parents. They had marital problems. Like, so all these dark themes, I mean, they go back to the Grimm Brothers days, trying to teach and educate through. That's a whole other topic in a way. It's like, would you rather teach your kids lessons through reading them Hansel and Gretel, or do you just sit down and say, hey, don't talk to strangers, or some hybrid of both? I think we'll skip what we're watching because we're running out of time, and we sort of went through a bit of that through this topic. So let's go into the weird news story that has a little bit of, I think, conversation involved in terms of what would we do perhaps in this scenario. But the scenario Sileem brought to us, it's Japanese man got town's COVID funds in error. Police say he gambled it away. Rather than return the $360,000 in COVID-19 aid that his small town mistakenly wired to his personal bank account, Sho Taguchi gambled most of the money away online, police said. Now the 24-year-old has been arrested after admitting having spent most of the money that was intended as pandemic relief for low-income houses. And it's caused quite a stir, apparently, in the town he lives in, a lot of media attention and outrage. These, it says here, the subsidies were deposited into his bank account in April. Each of the 463 low-income households in Abu, which has a population of just $3,000, was supposed to receive $780. So it ended up in his bank in error, and I wonder if he thought he had a windfall here and just went ahead with it. But interesting situation there.
So the guy got this amount, about $360,000 US dollars equivalent. And the next day, I think it was the next day, the town realized that they'd sent, or a few days later, the town realized that they made a mistake. They sent him this cash. So they sent a representative to his house. And he said, yeah, okay, sure, I'll return the cash. And went with the representative all the way to sort of the bank's doorstep, and then decided, wait, I'm not going to do this today. And went, so this is what's been being said in the media, right? So he goes back, and I think then he sort of mulls over his situation, and then he makes a number of transfers through like an intermediary payments facilitator, where he puts money into an online casino, online gambling site, and gambles away 300, almost all the money, right? So gambles away the whole $360,000. I don't know in the space of how long, but that's what he did, and so there's a lot of this story has gotten a lot of attention in Japan, and the guy eventually got arrested, and he's been arrested on charges of computer fraud, whatever that means. I want to sort of just jump in right here, like straight away with my 2 cents on this situation, right? First of all, so town wires you the money by mistake. You probably know you got it by mistake. I suppose one could just be like, okay, I'm going to do the right thing and return the money. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Technically speaking, he's not under, and I don't know whether this is legally the correct sort of legally correct or not. But I as far as I know, there's no legal obligation for the guy to have returned the money. He gets the money. He's not obligated to return it. No one can force him to do that. So it's either voluntary or not. So he says, well, I'm gonna keep the money, and I'm gonna go and gamble it all away, or maybe get lucky. And then now he's being arrested on these charges of computer fraud. I don't know what is the definition of computer fraud, but it sounds to me like the police just put a charge sort of together, some kind of a charge together to arrest the person, so the town can save face because they've essentially messed up, right? And they sent a lot of money to the wrong person. So I'm on Team Taguchi, and say, let the guy go. I mean, town made a mistake. He decided not to be a hero, and that's that. Mm-hmm. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, I guess that's the first question then. So you said there seemed to be no legal obligation for him to return it. Was he entitled to just take advantage of this mistake and assume it was his own, that to take this money and do? I don't think so. I think that they have the right to come to him and say, you can't just keep this money. I don't think that's right, that he can just put his hands up and say, sorry, I gambled it all away. I think there should be consequences for that.
Well, legally, right? That's the requirement, right? I mean, in some places that is the law, right? And a bank could try, like if a bank mistakenly put $1 million into your account, in some places, if you were to spend that money, you're liable for that money because it's not yours. And even though it's the bank's error, they know that you're aware that you didn't suddenly just get $1 million. If it's a few $100, maybe it's a simple mistake and that can be dealt with, but different story when it's this huge sum that's mistakenly put in there. But to your comment about there should be repercussions, it's being argued right now. And lawyer turned lawmaker turned Osaka governor Hashimoto Toru said the law is unclear. He said that previous civil and criminal judgments have deferred. But he also asserted the point that the town of Abu made a mistake by not attempting to freeze the man's account by the methods that were available to them. They could have actually done that independent of having to go visit him. So as soon as they realized their error, and before he withdrew the money, they actually had ways to have gone about that, to put a temporary freeze on his account.
Oh, okay.
And Hashimoto also said that if he was the man's lawyer, I don't know if he's trying to put his hand up to become the guy's lawyer, he said he would consider suing the town for compensation for putting him in this stressful position in the first place. he doesn't know whether or not he has a genuine claim, but he's suggesting it as a negotiating gambit because I don't know if he's of the competing theory side, which I'll get into in 1 second, but him throwing this out there in that way, I think to me says that he doesn't really believe in the computer fraud thing, kind of, to Sileem's point about like what does computer fraud constitute? It could be a fishing expedition, could just be a way to kind of ensnare him in this for long enough to put some of the blowback on him instead of the town. But the competing theory thing that I was mentioning, actually, there's some prominent political commentators that are theorizing that the reason this story has really taken off and has kind of quote unquote captured the attention and a lot of heat has been put on it is because about a week or two, there was starting to be a little bit of pressure to do some auditing of the government's use of public funds for COVID relief. And some people believe that this is kind of to take some of the scent off of that. So there's not so much of a drive to take an accounting of maybe how funds were misused throughout the last 2 years. One of the big cases was the Abe masks that were a complete disaster and a complete waste of money. So, that's one of those kind of conspiracy theory side things that are kind of going on around this story too. Is this all just, obfuscation to get people off the scent of other things?
Yeah. And I also feel that the guy was kind of almost an easy target, right? He's 24 years old. He's unemployed.
Yep.
He kind of looks a bit sketchy. If we are, not in my eyes, but sort of if you were a typical person in Japan, right, who doesn't know the world, you'd say, that guy, he's probably a bad person. He looks a bit sketchy and he spent it all sort of on, online gambling. So I can see why it's a story that it's easy to make that kind of story stick.
I when I consider myself someone that can see various sides to a situation, and I want to be on one side of the fence with it, but I at the same time I do kind of get your point about the whole, hey, too bad you put the money into the guy's bank account. That's your problem. He took it, spent it, but didn't he say he was going to return it and then he decided not to? So you could argue that he did say, hey, I'm going to do this, and then went ahead and found other ways to put that money to use than to return it. But I think, before we wrap this up, here's a question. Is there a quantum, if we look at situations where if you did find a certain amount in your bank account, because they came to him, right? Or did he come back
They went to him.
Okay. Is there a quantum that can land into your bank account that is a threshold of, do I call the bank and say, hey, there's $4,000 just came into my bank and I'm not sure what it's for. Can you clarify that? Or, $50 or $200, depending on how meticulously you track your expenses. Is there a quantum that you would say is the one you question? Or do you just tuck the money aside perhaps and say, one day they may come looking for this, and if they do, I'll give it back?
That's an interesting question.
Or do we save that for another episode?
Or is this like traveling to certain countries? Do you want to be careful about what we say here?
Oh yeah, Justin's always concerned about arriving at customs when they take him to a room with a chair and a desk, and he starts thinking about.
On episode 24, you said this about our country.
Yeah, everyone's hesitating to say something.
So no, wait. Like, maybe rephrase the question, or to clarify, are you asking me how much money would I have to receive in error, for instance, for me to say I'm keeping this cash and I'm getting the hell out of here?
Well, I guess that is sort of a different thing, because and it also, I think, has to do with how well you track your finances. If the bank accidentally gave me $67, I would not notice.
Right.
If it was a higher amount, maybe like, even then my wife does most of the finances in our house. I'm not sure that we would pick up, a fairly, like, something in the hundreds of dollars, but I did have a situation.
Folks? Clark is flexing right now.
Yeah. I did have a situation where I was told, I'm going to keep it vague just because it's better. I probably do that I owed a significant quantum of money
to a loan shark.
Yeah.
Was his name Tony?
That I didn't quite agree with, and I know by not revealing what it's about, but for fear of doing so, causing me challenges later, I will say this: this amount I was told I owed, I didn't appreciate that I did, and then I was given an explanation as to why I did, and said fine. And a year and a half later, no one's ever asked me to send it to them. So it's been sitting in limbo. But I always said to my wife, there could be a day when they knock on the door and it's not a loan shark. It's actually it's an official thing that again, I'll be vague about. But I guess after a certain amount of time, I'll probably think they've forgotten about it. And then maybe at some point, either some statute of limitations takes over and I'm in the clear, or I will have to pay it back, and probably with interest.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hopefully the juice hasn't been going all this time.
All right. Well, guys, we're at the hour. So I think we don't even have enough time to get through what we're watching, even though I thought maybe we might have a chance to. But it was great to get back on together. It's such a good opportunity to catch up. And I don't know, any closing comments before we go? Or did we already do it?
Did we do it? I don't know. No, it's good to be back on the show again. Podcast. It's like a show.
It is a show.
It is a show, isn't it? Yeah. The Clark Libby show? No.
We talked about this with Clark and friends.
CLS.
With Clark and friends. It's always good to be back, and looking forward to the next time where we can talk more about all sorts of different things. I think we've opened the door to many different topics, so it'll be good to re-explore them.
Typically that happens. It's like a rabbit trail. These topics do tend to have different trails they can go to.
Indeed.
All right, guys. Have a good rest of your Sunday night, and till next time.
Till next time.